Hi everyone. Today I'm taking you back to Austin, Texas in the early 1980s. There, a close-knit family was enduring a wave of terror and domestic violence connected to a recent breakup. By the time everything played out, there would be threats with a weapon, attempted shootings, breaking and entering, destruction of property, arson, assault, stalking, false allegations to a place of employment, and eventually there would be murder. So much of this heartbreaking situation has been left unresolved, with everything leading back to one violent woman who couldn't handle her relationship ending. In the end, 2 family members would end up dead, one confirmed dead and one presumed, because the woman I'm about to tell you about today has never been found. This story paints a terrifying tale of the reach of domestic violence and may challenge your preconceived notions of who can be the perpetrator of it. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved abduction and murder of Gracie Nash. December 26, 1983 was a regular evening of work for Gracie Nell Nash. During a time of year where many people have a week or 2 off for the holiday season, healthcare professionals don't have that luxury. The 39-year-old worked at the East Fair Nursing Home on Martin Luther King Boulevard in Austin, Texas, and she was due to get out of work late that evening around 11 p.m. The weather was uncharacteristically cold that night, and the highways were icy. One of Gracie's sisters was worried and looking out for her, so she had given her a call at work to tell her she should try to get out early if she could, and to just get home safe. Gracie told her sister she would try to do that, but as I'm sure healthcare workers can relate, that plan never came to fruition. She worked her full shift and actually stayed a few minutes over, so she didn't actually pack up and clock out until around 11:15 p.m. Gracie's plans that night were just to head straight home, where she lived in a multi-generational household that included her parents and her adult children, and at least one granddaughter. Gracie was the 4th of 17 children, and her family was extremely close. So what happened next was really out of character and out of the ordinary. Gracie just didn't come home. Gracie's brother Melvin described her as the backbone of the family. He said in an article by the Austin American-Statesman, quote, "She took our mother to the doctor, she got medicine for the kids, she'd pick up my cleaning for me, she'd do anything for her family," end quote. Melvin also described her personality as nice and said, quote, "You could put her in a pen with a bulldog and he'd get along with her," end quote. Which, I just love that. I can sort of kind of picture her disposition just the way they describe her. Like, I can totally picture that she's probably the type of person that random strangers in a grocery store would tell their life story to in the checkout line. Gracie had married young and had children young. In 1983, her kids were in their early 20s, and she also had an infant granddaughter that I mentioned. On the afternoon before she disappeared, she had actually drove into Austin from her home in Manor, Texas, to pick up medication for her granddaughter, and then she had dropped it back to the home before driving back to Austin for her shift. Gracie had divorced and moved back home with her family, and then she had had a steady long-term boyfriend whom she'd been with for several years. They had what was described as a happy and healthy relationship, but they maintained their separate living quarters, and they just dated in a way that worked for them. Gracie was known to be a homebody. Her father, John Henry Davis Sr., said to the Austin American-Statesman, quote, "Me and my wife tried to raise our kids right. You can ask anybody around here. None of our kids ever caused any trouble. Gracie didn't bother anybody. She didn't go to beer joints. She didn't do drugs. She only went to work and back home." Knowing all of that, they could scratch off the idea that she had just decided to leave work and go out for the night to blow off steam. That just simply wasn't her. But I imagine they were concerned that she had possibly been involved in some sort of accident given the road conditions. But Gracie's 1971 white and green Chevrolet was nowhere to be seen, not at the nursing home or anywhere along her route. So Gracie's increasingly concerned family reported her missing. They could not imagine what could have happened to her or who would have wanted to harm her. That was until the very next day when Gracie's mother, Annie Mae, received a disturbing phone call and certain pieces started to come together. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. As often as possible, I try to choose cases that need more attention and visibility, and the only way to get that visibility is to reach more people. That's where you come in. Sharing the podcast and its episodes with your friends and on social media expands the reach of the podcast. Leaving 5-star reviews and comments gives new listeners the motivation to try this podcast when they have so many others to choose from. I share case photos each week on Instagram, and I'm also on Facebook and TikTok. Thank you for all you do to support this work. Now, back to the episode. On the morning of December 28, 1983, Gracie Nash's mother, Annie Mae, was nervously waiting by the phone for any information about her missing 39-year-old daughter. When the phone rang, she picked it up, hoping it would be the call she had been waiting for. And in a way it was, but not in the way she was hoping. On the other line was a muffled voice. Some sources described it as someone attempting to conceal their identity and altering their real voice. But the voice seemed distinctly female. The call didn't last long, and the caller said the following: "If you want to see your daughter alive again, tell your son to drop the charges against the woman." And just like that, the caller hung up. You're probably wondering, what charges and what woman? And to get into that, I need to back way up and introduce you to a very important name in this story. Her name is Naomi Easley. In 1983, she was 27 years old and the ex-girlfriend of Gracie's brother, Melvin Davis, who also is affectionately called Butch. Butch and his oldest brother, John Davis Jr., both worked together at the City of Austin Electrical Department, where John was a supervisor. They also lived together in a house located at 7601 Blessing Avenue in Austin, where they'd lived for about 15 years. Butch had met Naomi Easley in the early 80s when they both attended the same softball game. They hit it off and had a few dates, but it was nothing serious. That was until they were reacquainted a couple of years later, and then they began a serious courtship. By April of 1982, Naomi had moved in with the brothers. Like many relationships, living together put the relationship to a test, and the romance started to fizzle out. By May of 1983, Butch broke it off with Easley. And to say that Easley did not take the breakup well would be an understatement. Shortly after they split, Easley wrote angry letters to Butch's boss at the electric company, trying to get him fired. She would do this repeatedly. A short while later, Butch would come home to find that someone had slashed the tires of his brother John's racing car, as well as the tires on the trailer that hauled the car. Butch and John were amateur automobile racers, and actually their sister Gracie was super supportive and into racing too. She would follow them all over Texas to cheer them on, and then she would help with the behind-the-scenes things too, like picking up parts for them. So taking a hobby that Butch and John loved so much and attacking their means to participate in it was definitely personal. Another time shortly after that, Butch Davis walked outside to find Naomi Easley pouring sugar and syrup in the gas tank of his Chevy Blazer. After the tire slashing incident, Butch's brother John had moved his prized racing car to a garage behind the family home in Manor, Texas. Shortly thereafter, the barn burned down, and the investigation into the fire found it to be the result of arson. Of course, everyone suspected Naomi Easley, but there was no physical evidence tying her to the crime. Things continued to escalate. Naomi had never returned her key to the house on Blessing Avenue that John and Butch shared. One day, Butch's brother John returned home and found the house had been ransacked, his clothes had been ripped out of his closet, and then they had been slashed. There was also evidence that someone had tried to start a fire in his bedroom. Then, one day, when Butch got home, he found Naomi waiting inside the home with a loaded gun, a gun that she proceeded to point at him. Butch stated that a scuffle ensued and he was able to wrestle the gun away from her and call police as she ran out of the house. But Naomi had the audacity to come back up to the house and ask Butch for her gun back. I won't share what he said was his direct quote back to her, but let's just say it was a no. At that point, Naomi pulled out a butcher knife and attempted to assault Butch again. Yet again, he was able to wrestle the knife away from her. And not much came of this event. Naomi presented the version of events as an equal responsibility domestic dispute that went too far, not a premeditated burglary with an intent to harm Butch. Butch and John changed their locks and Naomi was placed under a peace bond by the Justice of the Peace, Guy Herman. Under Texas law, a peace bond is a court order issued by a justice of the peace designed to keep the peace by protecting someone whose person or property has been threatened, but where harm has yet to occur. The peace bond orders the person who threatened to provide a bond payable to the state of Texas. If the person who made the threat commits the threatened offense, they then have to pay the amount of that bond to the state of Texas. In addition, if the bond is violated, the state can forfeit the bond and the accused can be punished for contempt, including fines and confinement. I'm not sure how confident Butch felt in this piece of paper keeping Naomi away, but I would think he had to at least hope that now that Naomi knew people were onto her and ordering her to stop the harassment, that maybe she would just back off a little bit. But any hope of that would be short-lived. In October, another brother of theirs, Ronnie, showed up to the house on Blessing Avenue, and as he walked inside, he found an intruder in the home. He did not get a good look at the intruder, but sensing he was in danger, he started backing out of the front door, trying to get to his car. It was then that the intruder fired 3 shots at Ronnie, thankfully missing him each time. I think it's worth noting that domestic violence was less talked about in the 80s, and the police response to it was significantly less involved. And that's with the idea that the man is the perpetrator of the violence. So when you think about it, Butch was having to report this domestic violence as a black man in a time when domestic violence was already not taken that seriously, and the idea of a woman being behind it was unheard of. Things really came to a head on November 18th, 1983, just after 8 p.m. Butch had just gotten home from work and he was getting ready to leave the house and go out for a beer that evening. He went to flip on the switch for his porch light and noticed that the bulb had been removed, so the porch was all dark. He replaced the bulb and started walking to his car when he said he just had a feeling wash over him where he felt an unsafe feeling in the pit of his stomach, and a voice sort of told him to look back towards the corner of his house. And when he did, that's when he spotted her. Naomi Easley was crouched near the corner of his house, dressed in all black with a black scarf covering her head. He heard a shot go off and he just took off running. One of the shots hit Butch in the wrist, breaking his arm. Butch was able to get to a phone for help and Naomi took off. But before long, he had identified her as his shooter and she was arrested. Naomi Easley was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, but she bonded out of jail within a couple of days to await the future trial. If at this point you thought being caught and charged with a serious felony caused Naomi to lay low, you'd be wrong. This is just my opinion, but I have to say she's one of the most chilling offenders I have ever researched in my time doing this. Her commitment to harming Butch and those around him is pretty unmatched. On November 21st, just 3 days after Butch's shooting, John was leaving the house to go to work just before dawn when an assailant shot at him. Luckily, all the shots missed. At this point, I'll say it, law enforcement is not doing enough at this point to protect this family from this woman. She will clearly stop at nothing, and given how dangerous she's acting and what lives are on the line, there needs to be ramped up patrol at this point. There needs to be someone sitting outside the Blessing Avenue home for a while, or someone tailing easily until she goes back at it again. Clearly, she's not really taking much pause between her crimes. But of course, that didn't happen. And on December 26th, Gracie Nash was abducted, and the day after, that fateful phone call was made, demanding the charges be dropped against, quote, the woman. And there's not one other woman who had charges pending related to this family other than Naomi Easley. Investigators working on the Gracie Nash case were retracing her steps out of the nursing home and looking for any clues as to where she may have encountered trouble. And this search paid off a little. A necklace that Gracie had been wearing that night had been found discarded in the parking lot, leading police to believe that there may have been a struggle in the lot as Gracie was walking out of work and walking to her car. Then, 2 days after Gracie's disappearance, they got another break. One that would shatter the family and their hope that Gracie was coming home. There in the parking lot of the New Manor Apartments was Gracie's car. New Manor Apartments are located at 2400 East 22nd Street in Austin, which is a half-mile away from the nursing home. Relatives out looking for Gracie spotted her car and called police. They braced themselves as they opened the trunk, but Gracie was not in there. As they examined the inside of the car, they were disturbed by what they saw. There were some of Gracie's clothes that she had been wearing, along with a coat she had received for Christmas. There was also a ton of blood. So much so that police shared that whatever Gracie had encountered, there was no way she was still alive after losing that amount of blood. Gracie's family would later say in an interview that even though the caller had talked about saving Gracie's life if the charges were dropped, her family believed she was already dead by the time of that phone call. Police were very interested in talking to Naomi Easley. Unfortunately, they would not be able to. Naomi already had retained a lawyer for her upcoming trial, and he was advising her not to talk to police regarding Gracie's case, or anything for that matter. The family and investigators were obviously very frustrated. Besides the bloody car, there were no more clues as to where Gracie may have gone and where they could find her body to at least give her a burial and provide some answers for her family. And as much as they had their suspicions, there was no forensic evidence tying Naomi to the vehicle or the hospital parking lot that day. And just when it seemed like nothing could get worse for Gracie Nash's family, evil struck once again. On January 31st, 1984, the Austin American-Statesman ran an article titled, "Disappearance of Manor Woman Tears at Tight-Knit Family." In it, Gracie's parents talked about how they could not understand why anyone would want to hurt their daughter, and how the whole situation had torn them apart and broken their hearts. Her mother, Annie Mae, said, quote, "I've been spending sleepless nights. I can't eat. She was just the best," end quote. And little did they know that their heartbreak was going to multiply just 3 days after that article ran. On the early morning of February 3rd, 1984, John Davis Jr. was walking to his car to head to work when he was shot at once again. But this time, the shooter didn't miss. John Davis Jr. was found lying in the middle of Wheatley Avenue, the street that intersects with his home on Blessing Avenue. Wheatley is where Davis parked his City of Austin truck that he used to go to work. Those who stumbled upon him checked for a pulse, but it was too late. John Davis Jr. was dead. Butch Davis watched in horror as the medical examiner wheeled his brother away. He said to an on-site reporter, quote, "What I've got now is a brother and sister dead. What's going to be next?" investigators did speak with Naomi Easley this time. She, of course, claimed she had nothing to do with John Davis Jr.'s death and said she was nowhere near the crime scene during that time. I'm unclear what alibi she gave, if any, but what I do know is that once again, police did not have any physical evidence tying her to the murder scene. Naomi Easley went to trial in March of 1984 for the shooting of Melvin Butch Davis. In the months leading up, the prosecution had ramped up their case and elevated the charges. She was now also facing attempted murder charges in addition to the assault charges, which, thank you, yes, just because she didn't succeed in killing Butch Davis that day doesn't mean that's not what she was trying to do. Butch Davis was able to testify to the terror he and his family repeatedly endured in the months leading up to his attack. He discussed the arson, the stalking, the guns and knives, and the tire slashing, but he wasn't allowed to discuss his sister's disappearance or his brother's murder. The details presented painted a horrible picture of the circumstances the Davis family was having to endure. Naomi Easley provided testimony in which she admitted to a lot of what Butch Davis had accused her of. She admitted that she had pulled a gun on Butch Davis and had threatened him with a knife. She also said that she slashed the tires. She also admitted to writing letters to Davis's boss, and she said it was because, quote, I was very angry and wanted him fired. And that's where most of her accountability stopped. Reading through a lot of the source material, much of her commentary presented their relationship as just tumultuous between the two of them, and sometimes her statements were on the verge of trying to make herself out to be the victim. For example, she stated that him breaking up with her and his behavior towards her after the breakup hurt her feelings, but she insisted she was never trying to convince him to get back together. Naomi Easley would go on to say that Butch and her would meet up to discuss their differences, and then he would say something that would make her angry, and she'd write another letter to his supervisors. And Easley insisted that no matter what other things she had done, she didn't shoot Butch Davis in the wrist. She said she was home that evening. When it came time for closing arguments, Easley's attorney came in hitting hard. Defense attorney Joe Turner said about the prosecution's case, quote, they spent 90% of their time talking about everything but November 18th. There is not one piece of physical evidence in this entire case that indicates Naomi Easley is guilty, end quote. In a sense, his point was that they were so focused on the harassment in the weeks leading up that they really didn't hone in enough on the one night surrounding his client's charges. He also pointed out that Easley had voluntarily turned over a pistol to police that did not match the gun used in the murder. Which to me doesn't mean a lot because, okay, so she has multiple guns and she turned over one that she didn't use. I don't know what that really proves. Jurors deliberated and they were feeling conflicted. Some jurors felt there was no way Davis could have identified Easley because of how dark it was outside. Some jurors allegedly had gained sympathy for Easley and discussed Butch, quote, going out on, or in other words, cheating on her, which is so irrelevant and mind-blowing to me, but that's what was reported. According to an article in the Austin American-Statesman, after about an hour of deliberations, the jury asked that the court reporter read back the testimony of the woman in whose house Davis sought help after the shooting. The woman testified Davis told her that he was shot by Easley, whom he referred to as that crazy fool. After deliberating less than 6 hours, the jury was deadlocked. According to that same article, State District Judge John Weiser asked if any juror thought his opinion could change if there were more deliberations. When nobody said yes to that, defense attorney Joe Turner moved for a mistrial, which was granted just before 10 p.m. Prosecutors did not oppose the motion. The final vote was 9 for guilty and 3 for not guilty. But of the 9 voting for a conviction, 3 were voting to find her guilty of attempted murder and 6 voted for a conviction of aggravated assault. Assistant District Attorney Carla Garcia vowed that the prosecution would be trying the case again. But that would never happen. Instead, a plea deal was reached 3 months later in June of 1984. In this deal, the attempted murder charge would be dropped if Naomi Easley would plead no contest to the aggravated assault charge. As part of the plea deal, she also received a lighter sentence: 10 years probation. Yes, you heard that right. Not any jail time. This woman sat on the stand and told everybody how she committed multiple felonies. And on the outside, those closest to the case know the full story, that 2 more people are dead and that every direction of those cases points back to Naomi Easley. But she got off with a genuine slap on the wrist. I can't imagine the outrage of Butch Davis and his family, and unfortunately, this light sentence would have dire consequences. In the years after Gracie Nash's abduction, there were no further clues as to her fate, and her brother John's case was also ice cold. The family stuck together and held out hope that there would be some form of accountability or answers at some point. But in the meantime, Naomi Easley moved on with her life. It seems she finally was done harassing the Nash Davis family and found herself a new man, a gentleman named Kent Moore. Naomi hyphenated her last name and became Naomi Easley Moore, and the two had a blossoming romance. Until, of course, they didn't. Much like with Butch Davis, the relationship soured and Kent Moore asked for a divorce. Once again, Naomi did not take this well, and some patterns started repeating themselves. Naomi began harassing Kent Moore, and he was fearful based on what he had otherwise found out about her past. On Sunday, November 5th, 1989, at around 10 p.m., Kent Moore called the police department. He spoke to police officer George Herrera and stated that his estranged wife, Naomi, was making threatening calls to him and that he was fearful for his safety because of her past. 4 hours later, in the early morning hours of November 6th, Kent Moore called back again. This time, he was frantic. He spoke to George Herrera again, but this time he let him know that he had been shot and that his estranged wife, Naomi Easley, was the person who had pulled the trigger. According to court records, Kent Moore could be heard on the call begging God to save him and was audibly in agony. Emergency workers would get him to Brackenridge Hospital, where he would die of his gunshot wounds. He reiterated with his dying breath that Naomi was the person who shot him. Naomi Easley was arrested and charged with murder. In September of 1990, Naomi went on trial for murder. Melvin Butch Davis was able to testify as a reputation witness about the harm she had done to him and attest to her violent past. Also in the trial, 9 police officers, 3 court officials, and 3 other witnesses testified about Easley on the state's behalf. They stated that Easley did not have a reputation as a, quote, peaceful and law-abiding citizen, and one officer referred to her reputation as, quote, terrifyingly bad. The jury deliberated for 5 hours before finding her guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 75 years in prison with the possibility of parole. Keep in mind, jurors were not allowed to hear about crimes she was suspected of. As such, Assistant District Attorney Reuben Young told the jury, "This woman is extremely dangerous." Marianne Powers, the other prosecutor, spoke to the jury and said, quote, "The state has brought you every type of evidence that is allowed by the law." And she asked for a lengthy sentence that would, quote, protect this community and any other men this defendant may come in contact with. Afterwards, when Powers was asked about the sentencing, she said that she was, quote, very pleased and ecstatic. Naomi Easley tried in vain to appeal the verdict on more than one occasion. At one point, she tried to say that letters to her church pastor were used as evidence and that those were privileged communications to a clergyman and shouldn't have been allowed. When the contents of the letter were revealed, her argument was almost laughable. In both letters, Naomi urged the pastor to testify that she was with him at the time her husband was killed. The letters warned the pastor that if he did not agree to testify, she would be forced to reveal the, quote, full truth about their personal relationship. The tenor of the letters can be shown by quoting a few paragraphs. In the first of the 2 letters, Naomi wrote, "Well, my friend, I must say, I am very disappointed in you. I expected you to come here and discuss this matter after you received my last letter. It's beginning to look like you're not my friend after all. You are my ace in the hole. I need to know now if you're willing to take a chance, suffer a little, a lot embarrassment, and come to court and testify that I was with you at the time my husband was killed. Believe me, I don't want it to become public that we've been seeing each other. If you decide not to testify, that's okay. I can't make you. I'll have to go at it alone. But that means I'll have to tell the full truth in order to explain why you will not come forth. Even if you deny it all, you know how people are. They're used to seeing me at your church wherever you preach. They'll put 2 and 2 together and realize that I'm telling the truth. The second letter warns, you may as well come talk to me or call my lawyer. A court order may make you come to court. Of course, we cannot make you say that I was with you that night, but this will turn into a very ugly battle between you and I. The ball is in your court. You make the next play. You can make it easy, or you can play hardball, and we all get battered and bruised. The choice is yours. According to court documents, the district court correctly found that Naomi's letters were not written to the pastor in his professional character as spiritual advisor. There's nothing in either letter that can even remotely be characterized as a request for spiritual guidance or consolation. The letters were nothing more than open threats to destroy the pastor's reputation if he did not provide an alibi to Naomi, and they could have easily have been addressed to any other man with whom Naomi had or could claim to have had a personal relationship. For what it's worth, it was the pastor who brought these letters to police, and he shared that Naomi and her husband were members of his church, and he testified that he did know Naomi and that she'd been to his home before, but they had no physical or sexual relationship, and that he was not with her on the night of the murder. I read that little snippet just so you can all see the depths of how far this woman will go to try to threaten and manipulate people. She is just dangerous. With Easley behind bars, the family of Gracie Nell Nash and John Davis Jr. were still left without answers. Butch joined forces with Gracie's daughter Barbara Nash, and in 2006, an update article was posted in The Statesman. Austin cold case detective Rick Blackmore was working with Gracie's family and existing evidence to try to close the case. He never mentioned any suspect by name, but it's clear who everyone thinks is responsible, if not largely connected to or behind this case. Detective Blackmore collected DNA from Gracie's family to put into databases so that if a Jane Doe is found, a connection can be made quicker. He also went back and re-interviewed old witnesses. He says that whoever committed the crime, he thinks has probably told somebody else about it, and he pleads with that person to come forward. But so far, that still hasn't happened, and at the time of this recording in early 2025, an additional almost 20 years has passed since that update. Barbara Nash, Gracie's daughter, talked about how Mother's Day over the years has been the hardest and how sad she feels when she sees other daughters with their mothers at church or at Sunday lunch. She said, quote, "I just think cruel thoughts like what they did to her. The family says I'm going to wear myself into a heart attack. It's been a long, hard 22 years. At the time of that article, investigators said they were so close to solving the cases, and they were just a tip or two away, and they felt the answers were coming soon. But like I mentioned, almost 20 more years has passed, and neither Gracie nor John's cases have had resolution. Naomi Easley first came up for parole in 2009 and has so every 2 years since. She is now in her late 60s, and in her most recent parole hearing, she was denied for the following reasons. First, for criminal history. It says, quote, "The record indicates that the offender has repeatedly committed criminal episodes that indicate a predisposition to commit criminal acts upon release." The second was because of the nature of the offense. The record indicates the instant offense has elements of brutality, violence, assaultive behavior, or conscious selection of victims' vulnerability, indicating a conscious disregard for the lives, safety, or property of others, such that the offender poses a continuing threat to public safety. And the third was adjustment during periods of supervision. The record indicates unsuccessful periods of supervision on previous probation, parole, or mandatory supervision that resulted in incarceration, including parole in absentia. Naomi Easley's next parole hearing is in November of this year, 2025. If Naomi Easley was involved in the disappearance of Gracie Nash and the murder of John Davis Jr., it's highly likely that she told somebody else or that somebody else assisted her. Or there is the remote possibility that it's another explanation or another perpetrator, and police haven't even considered this person. This family has been through more than people could imagine weathering, and they deserve to have at least some answers so they can move forward to the next chapter of their life and their healing journey. If you have any information on the murders of Gracie Nash or John Davis Jr., please contact the Austin Police Department at 512-974-8643. I want to take just one more moment here to point out that men face some barriers when they become victims of intimate partner violence. Patriarchal stereotypes of men assume that women are the sole victims of intimate partner violence, and this can make it difficult for men to be believed by others. According to studies, it can even make it difficult for men to believe people when they are told they are the victims of intimate partner violence. It is very common for men to avoid reporting or admitting to cases of domestic violence due to various reasons, such as fear of ridicule, embarrassment, and lack of support. This taboo subject is often trivialized and ignored by society, which makes it hard to determine how prevalent the issue is. Due to the lack of support services and healthcare professionals, male victims often don't receive the necessary assistance they so deserve. This is not how it should be, and I want to reiterate, just like I did last episode, if you're experiencing what feels like it might be intimate partner violence, there's help. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. There is various languages. They have English, Spanish, and 200 plus through interpretation services, and it's 24/7. Call 800-799-7233. You can also text the word BEGIN to 88788. This has been A Simpler Time True Crime. Tune in every Monday as I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the simplicity and safety of bygone days. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, there are several ways you can help me grow. First, tell your podcast-loving friends about the show. Next, leave me a 5-star review on your chosen listening platform. Also, subscribe to the podcast and follow me on socials. I post most on Instagram at simplertimecrimepod, but I also have Facebook and TikTok. Case suggestions are welcome via email at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. I have so many goals for the new year, and all of them require more of an audience, so thank you in advance for spreading the word. And as always, thank you for listening.